ladies and ladies. So, oh no, there's a gentleman right there. Thank you, gotcha. There's two right there. Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books right here in the cultural heart of Coral Gables. We appreciate you being here. My name is Steve. On behalf of everyone here at Books and Books, welcome. While you are silencing your cell phones, please take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a rundown of all the wonderful events we have at Books and Books every night of the week. You can pick up a copy of this out on the counter where tonight's books are being sold. We have Spanish events, kids events, celebrity signings, poetry readings. There's always something for everybody's taste, and many of them now are being live streamed through the internet, as you can see by these cameras throughout the store. Also, I will remind you that since this is being broadcast through the internet all over the world, these cameras pointed at the audience, just make sure for the benefit of those watching that you're sitting next to who you're supposed to be sitting next to. I also remind you that flash photography is forbidden because it interferes with the live stream presentation, but you can turn off your flash, I'm sure, and take a picture. Anyway, I encourage you to take a copy of this. If not, you can go to our website, booksandbooks.com, give us your email address, and that way we can send you something so that you don't need to miss anything here. And with the live stream technology, you don't even have to be in the store. Those of you watching online can call the store at the number on the screen below. You can order a copy of the book while the event is in progress, or even call and ask a question of the author. But tonight we're very happy to have with us Kristi Cook and her book, Magnolia. Jenna and Ryder are far from friends until a storm stirs up their passion in this contemporary Southern romance from the New York Times best-selling author Kristi Cook. Ms. Cook also publishes adult titles under the names Christina Cook and Kristi Astor. Her YA novels include Haven, Mirage, and Eternal. She lives in New York City, where I'm sure it's much cooler than it is here tonight. Please give a nice, warm Books and Books welcome to Kristi Cook.
Thank you. I want to first thank you all for coming. This is the first time I've ever done a launch, not in my home area, in and around New York City. So it's kind of disorienting to be somewhere else, so I really appreciate all the support that I'm getting here. So I guess I'm going to start with a little reading from the beginning of Magnolia. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about it first. Magnolia was a book that first came to me as the idea first came to me as doing kind of a reverse Romeo and Juliet. I'd read several retellings of Romeo and Juliet where they were just, taking the story and putting it in a modern setting and sort of following the storyline that way. And then it occurred to me that because that's so tragic and, they're falling in love immediately and then, horrible things happen, that what if I did a reverse Romeo and Juliet? So instead of, a small town where there's these two families that hate each other and their kids fall in love, well, what if I did the opposite? And I had a small town where there's two families that love each other and their biggest wish is that their kids would get together. But instead, their kids don't like each other, or at least think they don't like each other. So that was what the seed for Magnolia came. And then I've always wanted to write a book set in the state of Mississippi. I actually, even though I live in New York City now, I grew up down south. And I did go to college in Mississippi at the University of Southern Miss. And living in Mississippi for 4 years was like something else. It's one of those things that, on the one hand, we see Mississippi falling on these, whenever there's lists of things, Mississippi's often on the bottom of them. And it kind of, gives the state somewhat of a stigma. And the thing, of course those things are true, but then there's also just something sort of magical about the place that it's kind of lost in time to a certain degree, that especially looking around at my sorority sisters there that were mostly Mississippi girls, I'd never seen, girls like this. They were all beautiful. They were all beauty pageant girls. And yet they also were straight A students who could sew, and some of them could shoot a gun. And, they were very accomplished, kind of in the way that we think of Pride and Prejudice, accomplished women, that I'd never met so many accomplished women in my life. So I sort of wanted to capture a little bit of that Southern charm and the Southern girl that is kind of a dime a dozen down there, that can do all these things. So I wanted to capture a bit of that and a bit of the small town charm, and I hope that's what I did. So I was really excited to visit Mississippi that way in my head, and I chose to make up a completely fictional town up near Ole Miss, even though that's not where I went to school. But it's just so beautiful up there in Faulkner country. So that's why I decided to set it there. And then there's a lot of things about the magnolia tree. It's very hardy. It can sustain, high winds and storms. So there's a lot of themes about strength and sort of finding your strength in this novel. So the title seemed pretty fitting. So that's the basic story of where the book came from. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the first few pages, which this is weird to some people. It's set up in acts and scenes like the play. So Act 1, for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. William Shakespeare. Act 1, Scene 1. Glancing out my window, I hold up my finger and thumb, creating a little frame around Ryder Marsden, who stands outside on the lawn below. I close one eye to get the illusion just right and then pretend to squash him. Take that. I let the curtains fall back against the glass, effectively blocking the view of my nemesis standing there beneath the twinkle lights, looking way too hot in his charcoal-colored suit. It would be so much easier to hate him if he didn't look so good. And I want to hate him, I really do. You know those tragic stories where two kids from feuding families fall in love? Okay, flip that inside and out and turn it on its head, and you've got our story, Ryder's and mine. It all began like this. On April 6, 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, Captain Jeremiah D. Marsden, that's Ryder's ancestor, took a minie ball in the left kneecap. Corporal Lewiston G. Cafferty, that's mine, picked up Captain Marsden and carried him off the field of battle to safety. On his back, more than a mile, barefoot. At least that's how the story goes. Frankly, I'm a little skeptical, but whatever. The point is, the Marsdens and the Caffertys have been like this ever since. And when I say like this, I'm talking complete and utter familial devotion. Our families' lives are so intertwined, it's sometimes hard to remember who belongs where and with whom. We do everything together, church, backyard barbecues, even vacations. One of my favorite stories is about the time my Uncle Don was somehow left behind with the Marsdens after a trip to the coast and no one noticed for 2 weeks. Seriously. The Marsdens and the Caffertys play out their drama right here in Magnolia Branch, Mississippi, population 2,190. This little slice of heaven boasts 1 traffic light, 6 churches, a library, and a picturesque town square. The only nod to civilization is a ward's just off the highway, and you wouldn't believe how hard some of the locals fought it when they first proposed it, back before I was born. If you're wondering what it's like to grow up here, just consider this. There are 6 choices when it comes to places of worship, but only 1 when it comes to fast food, the aforementioned wards. Need I say more? By the way, if you want to see some real Shakespearean-style feuding, look no farther than First Methodist and Calvary Baptist. They've been going at it for years. Truth be told, not much has changed here in Magnolia Branch since the war. And when anyone around here says the war, they mean the Civil War. Yeah, 150 years and several other wars later. The Marsdens still live at Magnolia Landing, an old antebellum-era plantation house on 200-plus acres down by Flint Creek. It looks just like you'd imagine, pristine white and perfectly symmetrical with huge columns and a half-mile-long drive shaded by a canopy of ancient oaks dripping Spanish moss. And we Caffertys still live just down the road in a house that once served as Magnolia Landing's overseer's cottage. The house has been added onto several times throughout the years, giving it a haphazard, rambling look. Even so, I think it's perfect. Whitewashed brick and clapboard with wide plank floors and sleeping porches. Unlike Magnolia Landing, our house looks comfortable and lived in. Visiting the Marsdens is like visiting a museum. And really, who wants to live in a museum? Anyway, our families have been desperate to unite through matrimonial bliss for as long as anyone can remember. But as fate would have it, they were always out of sync, or totally in sync, depending on how you look at it. Either way, in all these years, there hasn't been a single eligible male-female pair who could get the job done. Until Ryder and me, that is. I'll stop there. Thank you. So that actually kind of gives you the whole setup of the story right there. And these two like to fight, that's all I'll say. And a big storm, a hurricane, is headed towards the coast. And a good portion of the book takes place in the middle of a hurricane and the subsequent tornadoes. And they're kind of stuck together, those two. So they discover maybe they don't hate each other quite as much as they thought they did. It's really a romance. I came from a background of writing romance. I have a decades-long career with some historical romance and a NASCAR romance thrown in there for good measure. So I really enjoy the romance aspects of it. So this is definitely categorized as a YA romance, just so that you're not surprised by that from that beginning. And it's a fun book, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about anything, about the book, about my previous series, the Winter Haven series. Actually, this week, the last final book in that series came out in paperback, so I'm kind of celebrating that release too. Or any questions about the craft of writing, I'm perfectly happy to answer. So I'll open up the floor. Anyone? Come on, questions.
Your writing process. Do you think that you write out of order? Do you outline?
She's asking about my writing process, if I write out of order or if I outline. I wish I was one of those people that's a really organized writer. Because I'm now at that point in my career that I get a contract with just a proposal, so I'm sort of forced to write just the first 3 chapters and an outline before I get the approval from my publisher. I'm sort of forced to write a very vague outline. This was a very rare exception where I think I sold this manuscript to my publisher on 7 pages, and that was it. It was basically like what I read to you. It was almost all they had. So this book I had to do a lot of figuring out as I went along. I don't really recommend it. Like when I teach classes, I try to teach building a structure that's at least a bare bones structure, where at least you know the major kind of plot points, the black moment, and the resolution. And I think that's really kind of all I had for this story, and then I was just sort of finding my way through it. Luckily, it's a pretty short book, and it happens in a pretty short span of time, which made it a little easier. But yeah, I'm one of those writing from the seat of my pants usually, figuring out the plot as I go along. It's kind of a bad habit. Especially when you're writing a series like the Winter Haven, where it was 3 books, and I wrote that very first book just sort of for fun between my historical romance contracts, with no idea it was ever going to get published or have sequels published. So I just wrote and wrote and wrote, and I wasn't really thinking about it. I knew how the series was going to end, but I had no idea how many books there would be or how I was going to get to that. And I wrote myself into so many corners. And then when it became a series and there was 2 new books, and there was many, many times that I was sort of backed into a corner going, how am I going to get out of this? So I wish that I had planned it out a little more carefully. Hopefully it worked out, but yeah, I'm not much of a planner. Yes?
Why did you choose writing?
What was that?
Why did you choose writing? What inspired you?
What inspired me to write? I think like most writers, I'm just a crazy, voracious reader. I love to read, and my favorite books I've read 50 times over and over and over again. I just like to get lost in those worlds. And it's funny, I ask my students this question a lot, and it's amazing to see how they all raise their hand and look around and think, wow, I thought it was just me. But I always say, how many of you, when you were a child, would put yourself to sleep at night by thinking up stories in your head? And sometimes they were original, sometimes it was like, oh, I just finished seeing Grease for the 9th time. Now I'm spinning stories for Sandy and Danny in my head. That was something I did to entertain myself as a child. And when I asked my students, it's amazing how many of them also did the same thing. Did any of you in here do that too? Yeah, a lot of people. I think that's just, when you're like that, you're just sort of a natural kind of storyteller, and you like to get lost in worlds. So I had a career after college as a grant writer in some of New York City's public institutions, the American Museum of Natural History and American Ballet. So I wrote a lot of grant proposals, and they were very dry, boring 50-page proposals. So I had a lot of technical writing skills, but hadn't done much fiction writing other than, I guess it was early fan fiction. I tried writing a sequel to Gone with the Wind when I was 12 in a spiral notebook. I think I got about 12 pages in before I gave up. We didn't call it fan fiction back then. So after I had children, I stopped working, and I was basically going crazy for some sort of intellectual stimulation, and was reading a lot of historical romances at the time, a lot of Juliet Quinn. I found her, and then I just read everything she ever wrote. And so I thought, I really like to come up with worlds, and so I decided to try writing then. And I wrote a historical romance manuscript, and I found a critique group and critique partners, and it was this wonderful kind of online community that, in my mind, at least got me out of my changing diapers at home kind of mode. And so that first book, actually, I got an agent and got a 2-book publishing contract, and before I knew it, it was, career takeoff time, and I haven't looked back. I have changed around a lot. I went from historical romance to a little bit of contemporary with a NASCAR, but I really had hit a point where I was just reading so much YA fiction, and there was so much good things happening in YA fiction. It was really like as much as I love romance, romance is and it's not at all a formula, and I get annoyed when people say that. The only formula is that it's a happily ever after. But it's a lot more constrictive in what kind of book it is. It's basically there's going to be a hero and a heroine, and they're going to fall in love. So with YA, there was just so many other opportunities to explore other things that I was very excited to start writing that. And once I got into it, I never looked back. Yes?
Can you give us an example of, I'm so curious, when you wrote yourself in a corner?
Writing myself in a corner. Really what I mean is sometimes I just sort of threw things out there that before I knew why or what it meant. It was kind of really dangerous. There was one specific example where I can't even remember what it was that I threw out in the second book. And one of my critique partners called me and was like, "Oh, I loved that thing with whatever it was." She was like, "That was so gutsy. What's going to happen with that? I'm dying to know." And I was like, I have no idea. Like, I just threw that out there. I don't know what it means. I don't know how I'm resolving it. And I think I eventually did have to come up with a way in the third book to resolve it, so it wasn't just sort of hanging there. But I can't remember specifically. But really, in theory, what it is that I'll just put something out there before I've actually figured out what it means to my story and or how it's going to resolve, which I don't really recommend doing. She thought it was very gutsy, though. She was like, "Wow, that takes guts to do that." I'm like, no, that takes stupidity to do that. That's all. Yes?
Was it going from historical romance to YA romance? Like you said, there's always, the girl and the guy who fall in love, but did
Right.
you find YA restricting, not as to what was going to happen, but maybe the language, the situations that may not be the same as to adults as opposed to teenagers? Did you have
Right.
to get a different mindset to, go into a younger audience with younger characters?
Definitely as far as the mindset. Well, on the one hand, writing historical romance, the good thing about it is when you're writing women who are falling in love in the Regency era, they're only like 18 years old. So they were actually fairly close in age. And I often did that thing where I had the, old maid heroine so that I could not make her 19 years old. I would have the 26-year-old heroine. Just because in reality, it really was 17, 18-year-old girls marrying 33-year-old men. And I don't think modern readers really, that's icky in a way to modern readers, believe it or not. My heroines in my older books were generally pretty young anyway, so it wasn't such a shift. And as far as the language, that's one thing a lot of my historical or my adult romance peers who, for a while there, it looked like YA was like the jackpot way to go. So there was a lot of people sort of jumping from one to the other because mass market was dying, YA was growing, so there was a lot of people making that shift. And I had made the shift early, and then I would have people ask me about it and say, "So you just have to dumb down the book, right?" And I was like, "Okay, you should not be writing YA fiction if that's what you think." If anything, it's almost like the reverse, and I know that sounds crazy to say it, but teenagers or sitting in the classroom. You know, we were talking at dinner, the kind of books that teenagers have to read. You know, they're reading classics, they're reading Shakespeare, and they're reading Catcher in the Rye. They're reading some really complex books, Fahrenheit 451, you know, every day, all day. I don't know a lot of adults that are sitting around reading that kind of literature on a regular basis. So in many ways, I feel like teenagers are almost more sophisticated readers. So I don't really think about the, you know, any kind of the language. I just don't even think about that when I'm writing, just because I think teenagers are such sophisticated readers. But it is funny and disheartening when other romance authors will say, oh, you just dumb it down, you make your sentences really simple. I'm like, okay, we're not talking about 4-year-olds, like we're talking about teenagers. You realize they read, you know, big books sometimes, more often than most adults do. So other than that, you know, it was more of a shift of voice, like you said, finding that kind of teen voice. And I will say most of the YA writers that I know, this sounds like it's mean, but it's not. We're all like, you know, 16-year-olds trapped in a, you know, 40-year-old body. Like, we are very in touch with our inner 15-year-olds. I don't know why that is or what it says about us, that, you know, we like to be stuck in that mentality. So that part's easy. I totally remember what it was like to be 16. And in fact, I have found that to be true about many YA authors too, is they're not the type of people that say, oh my God, being a teenager was awful. I hated being a teenager. They're the people that enjoyed their teenage years and, you know, enjoy that, the first love, the first, you know, doing things on your own kind of thing. So it was pretty easy for me to, sadly enough, get in touch with that. Did that kind of answer the question? Okay, I went on a tangent there, sorry. Any other questions? Come on, hit me up with questions. Yes? Go.
Right now, on the theme of reading, what would you recommend? Either or, doesn't matter, contemporary, historical romance, things like that.
Oh, it's all so good out there right now. It really is. I mean, it's kind of a resurgence right now in the contemporary romance. It's weird how it goes through these phases. You know, first it was paranormal, everything was paranormal. And then what happens is everybody writes paranormal and they publish 5 million of them. And then, I mean, I guess then the quality starts going down because the publishers are just sort of snatching up everything they can get their hands on. And, you know, that bubble burst. And then it was dystopian. And they're always guided by, you know, the first paranormal was guided by Twilight. The dystopian was guided by, you know, Hunger Games and things like that. That bubble, you know, you couldn't turn around without there being a new dystopian. And then same thing happens, that they get fewer and farther between the really good ones, and everyone starts getting sick of them. So right now is just the height of contemporary, and it's sort of weird because people will say, oh, contemporary's, you know, popular now for the first time. Like, there have always been contemporary young adult romances. It's just been a solid, consistent market. You know, and what happens? John Green comes along and publishes a vastly popular, you know, that turns into a popular movie, and now contemporary is all the rage again. So I think now is a good time. It hasn't gotten to that big bubble where it's glutted quite yet, and publishing as a market is sort of shrinking anyway. So I think there's some really terrific contemporary voices out there right now. That doesn't mean that the other stuff isn't good too. If anything, the paranormal and the dystopians and the sci-fi that's getting published now probably is even better than what it used to be, because now it's so rare that if you wrote a dystopian and sent it out on submission, you know, so many editors would be just like, I don't even want to see it. So it would have to be really, really good to get published right now. So if you could find any of those, I'm sure they're terrific. I think The Winter's Curse maybe has some, doesn't that have some paranormal something going on? It's not realistic, right? And everyone says it's terrific.
It's
Not
not paranormal.
paranormal?
It feels a little historical.
Really?
I mean, it's not based on real events, but it
Right.
almost feels like Civil War-ish type of.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I want to read it. But that's, you know, a prime example of something that's not what's the popular thing right now. And everyone says it's terrific. I'm sure it must be. And that's because it must have been really hard to get published. It had to be really, really good. Any other questions? Yes.
What are your top 3 favorite books
of all time. I know that's really tough. Okay, 5.
Of all time. Okay, 5. Gone with the Wind. So it's not a surprise that I wrote a Southern set book. It's not a surprise I even have a degree in history. Gone with the Wind would be why. The Hunger Games, and I just have to lump that all together as one. Harry Potter, I have to lump all together as one. And then I would be fighting with myself between the 2 Stephanie Perkins. Because when I'm reading Anna and the French Kiss, I like it better than Lola. But then when I'm reading Lola and the Boy Next Door, I like it better than Anna. So I have to lump those 2 together. And now there's a 3rd one coming out next week. I would say that is the top right there for me. At least the ones that I couldn't, stop thinking about and have reread a bazillion times. Any other questions? Yes?
When first-time writers self-publish and they don't get a market for readers?
It is such a great time right now in publishing because there are so many choices. And I think self-publishing is a terrific choice. And especially for certain genres. I think how well you can find a readership in some degree depends on what kind of book you write. Like if you're writing middle grade, I think you're going to have a really hard time finding a readership. Middle grade books are still very strong, and they generally, children, go through a gateway, a librarian, a parent, so they're not just discovering books on the internet the way that other age groups are. YA, I think many people have. It's not the gold rush that it used to be with Amanda Hocking. She started off the real self-publishing boom where she became a huge, success with a huge readership immediately. I think right now, if you're writing new adult fiction, self-publishing is the way to go. That I think it's just the best way to find a readership. Those people are downloading on the Kindle. They're looking for the good price, 99-cent, $1.99 books. If you're writing for that market, I think it's a great way to find a readership. And even adult fiction, adult romance and other adult fiction, I think there is a readership out there. For me personally, I feel like having a joint, a hybrid career they call it, where you're doing some self-publishing and some traditional publishing. Self-publishing, again, is mostly going to be on the Kindle, on the Nook, on the whatever. You're not going to find your books in the stores. So, you can get a much broader readership with traditional publishing, which is why that's my preference for my stuff right now. But then I am self-publishing my backlist, my historical romances that would otherwise be out of print. And I know many people who do both, both at the same time, which is fine. But, I really do think that there are all kinds of avenues and that it's a great way to get from, a self-publishing career to a traditional career if you want to make that step. So there's readers out there for everything. Yes?
What are you working on right now?
Right now? Well, I'm actually working on a middle grade manuscript that I'm co-writing with an actual middle grade aged person. And it's actually set, it's kind of a time travel with Civil War stuff because I love the Civil War, and it's the kind of thing that I don't think would do well in any other age group other than middle grade. So I'm working on that, and then I'm working on just starting a new young adult that is set in Florida actually, but up in the Panhandle, which is where I went to high school, up on a beach town up there. And it's similar to Magnolia in that I would say it's a romance, a YA romance. And with the town sort of playing a big role in the setting. I really like to use the setting more fully than in some of my other books. And that's all I'm working on right now. I'm a very slow writer, unfortunately. I wish I was more prolific. But getting the idea right in my head takes a very long time. That's the thing. I have to get it all figured out. Like I said, I don't really plot or outline, so I have to get it all working in my head before I can put it down on paper. Yes?
How do you physically, do you have a schedule that you set for yourself? Do you wake up at 5 and start writing, or when do you write during the day? Do you do it at home, or do you do it in a studio? Or
I do write at home. I have a home office, And I wish I could say that I was one of those people. Like I know Nora Roberts at all the RWA conferences I went to says every day she gets up, she goes to her office, and she works for a certain, set period of hours. And that's why she's a wonderfully prolific author with so many books out. And it's funny because my kids are, middle school and high school, so they're gone all day, and that should be my writing time. But I don't know, I'm one of those people that if I'm not feeling it, then I have a hard time, just sitting and putting words on the page isn't really going to work for me unless I'm really in that mode. So often during the day I get the businessy side of writing done. And I also work with a small press and I do some editing, so I do that during the day. Usually my actual writing is more often happening at night, weirdly enough, when I should be not writing. But I definitely feel like that there's no right answer for everyone. And if you can sit down every day from 9 to 3 and write, that's wonderful. But if you're just going to be forcing it and have to delete everything that you've written during that, you have to find when it's working for you. And unfortunately, I'm a night writer. Maybe that'll change someday. I keep trying to force it, but no such luck. Other questions? Yes?
I was one of your students in class, so one time you mentioned that sometimes you struggle with your publisher about the design of the book and so forth. Do you envision that that's the way you write?
No. They heard me talking about it earlier. I like the way they look. They don't look exactly like I pictured them in my head, especially him, because I admit I was picturing Alabama quarterback A.J. McCarron in my head the entire time I was writing it. And he's really, really tall and doesn't really look like that. But I think they're perfectly attractive, and I think they really captured the feel of how they would be interacting. I think they did a great job with that. And I love the stormy lookingness of the cover. We did go through a couple versions that look like Kentucky, and I was like, wait, they look like they're in a Kentucky horse farm. So I actually had a sorority sister in Mississippi who's a photographer who was literally driving her car around Mississippi, she lives in Jackson, stopping her car and snapping pictures and sending them to me, and I was sending them on to the art department going, this is what Mississippi looks like. So they made a few changes, and at least we got a house in there, and that kind of looks like it could be in Mississippi, and it doesn't look like Kentucky anymore, other than the fence. So in the end, I am pretty pleased with it. I think it captures it pretty well. I would have thought there would have been a magnolia tree, but
You got the flower.
yeah, there's the flower. The flower. It's a pink magnolia instead of a white magnolia, but no, I really do like it. At least I think it doesn't look like every other YA cover out there. So I do like that bit about it. That is one of the things that some people don't understand is can't believe the number of people that actually think I designed the cover myself or had something to do with it. That with traditional publishing, I'm in charge of what's between the pages, and the packaging is an entire different set of people doing it. And you just have to have faith that that's their job and that they do a good job. But I am very happy with that cover. And and the Gemma and Ryder are there looking like they don't like each other very much. Yes?
When writing characters, do you ever find yourself kind of describing people that
That I
like real
know.
people?
Yes. Very often. Sometimes people are combinations of people. This book, not so much. The middle grade that I'm working on now, every character is, not every character, but many characters are just like many of my kids' friends. And I'll describe them and they'll then say, oh, you mean, and say the kid's name. And I'm like, well, not exactly like them. But I do that to a certain degree. I didn't do it so much in there. I do, though, see, I'm one of those very I want to say visual people, but I'm actually not a very visual, creative person. I can't visualize people that I haven't seen, or I have a very hard time doing it, or anything that I haven't actually seen. So I generally do kind of cast my books as I'm writing them, and especially the main characters, I'll just find a picture of an actor or an athlete or just somebody, it could be a random person, and print it out and write the character's name and tape it to my computer desk. Or now I do Pinterest boards so that I can see them. It just helps me visualize them. And I know some readers don't like that because then they think it interferes with, they don't want to know who I saw. They want to visualize the character themselves. So it's a fine line. But I have a hard time visualizing characters unless it's actually physically based on somebody. Although Gemma, I don't think I did that sort of after the fact. The main character, I don't think I have to see in my head as much as everybody else because I'm sort of seeing the story through their eyes, very weirdly. Yes?
Do you find it harder to give them a personality if they're faithless?
I don't think so, not if it's the point of view character. When it's the point of view character, I kind of figure out, it's pretty easy for me once I know their background and their history. It's pretty easy for me to sort of drop into their, what would someone be like who had been through that kind of life circumstances? So with a point of view character, not really. With the other characters, I don't base their personality based on who I think they look like so much. So I guess the answer is no. Yes?
Have you ever had a hard time separating your personality from a character that you think is kind of like you and making them like their own person?
Right. That is definitely a tough thing, and to some degree, I try to stay away, for the most part, from characters who are a lot like me. When I wrote the first Haven book, originally I had that main character who's from Atlanta, which is kind of where I'm from, and I had her as a dancer, which I was. And then I started really feeling like a lot of crossover. And so ultimately I ended up getting rid of her dance background and making her a fencer instead, which made sense for the story. It would be a skill that would actually help her in the story if she was a fencer. So it made more sense anyway. And I do generally try to give my characters some sort of touchstone that is a little bit something I identify with, just because it helps me identify with the character. But like I said, for that reason, I generally try to make sure, Gemma is a crack shot in this book. She's the best shot in all of Magnolia Branch, Mississippi, and I am not a gun person at all. Didn't grow up shooting, certainly, did not. So I like to make my characters very different from me, just because it's then fun to kind of experience those things vicariously through a character. And so I generally don't even recommend. I know a lot of people think it's easier to write what you know, and that is what people tell you, but exactly what you said can then happen, that then you start overlapping and that line between you and the character gets blurry, and I think you can run into trouble with your character that way. But that is something I am generally very aware of as I'm writing, and I tend to go the other way and make them very different from me, even if maybe I share a thing or two with them. That makes sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
We live in a multimedia culture, and I was wondering how movies, television, and the idea of scripts, how does this affect you in any way in your writing, especially when now so many books are very quickly converted into media experiences.
Right. Well, we do hear a lot. You hear about how everyone's attention span is shorter, and that, there was a time that major publishers considered an adult romance novel to be 100,000 words, and then they wanted 95,000 words, and then they wanted 90,000 words. And there was a lot of blame on the attention span of readers because they were used to short bites of things and not wanting the big kind of saga thing. So I am very conscious of that, but more so I would say I'm a very cinematic writer, and I do envision my books not not as movies, but I see them, I try to envision how they would be if they were. That, you know, each scene I try to see like a scene in a movie or in a television show. There was one manuscript I was reading once that, you know, an entire chapter that I, you know, as I was reading it, noticed, well, this chapter, if we were to put this in a movie, it would, this entire chapter would happen in 4 seconds, 5 seconds. You know, there was basically nothing happening other than 5 lines of dialogue with 4 pages of introspection between each line of dialogue. And I think that it, in many ways, it is a good thing to try to think of it in, you know, as a movie, and try to think, well, okay, what if the scene was playing out on the screen? You wouldn't want it to only last 5 seconds. So to that degree, I guess I'm influenced by it. And I'm told, you know, I hear voices saying people have shorter attention spans. They like little things. I try to control my pacing to make my pacing a little brisker because of that. But otherwise, I'd say that's the only way, at least that I think about it, affecting my own writing.
What are your favorite movies? And are they movies that came from novels?
Many of them are. And obviously, then my favorite movie would also be Gone with the Wind. Also my other favorite, which is based on the novel. And, you know, that's a great example of it's very, very different from the book. I mean, there's so much in the book that's not in the movie. It's still a 4-hour movie. And it's still wonderful even with that other stuff cut out. So I think it's such a great example of taking a really long book, condensing it into a still really long movie, but losing a lot of the story and still doing a great job. Many, actually, of my favorite movies. I would say all the Harry Potter movies are also my favorite movies. They're also based on books. It's funny, I never really thought about it, but yeah, I mean, obviously I love the Hunger Games movies, which are based on the books that I like. And I, as my poor kids will attest to, I've seen The Fault in Our Stars 5 or 6 times in the theater. And I would say it's one of my current favorite movies, and I actually like the movie a lot more than the book, which is unusual. I'm usually the other way around.
Besides that specific book, are there any other movie adaptations that you prefer over the book?
Movies that are better than the books. Yeah, The Notebook. The Notebook, I think, was a terrific, I mean, it was it wasn't like a great, you know, fine film, but I loved that movie. And then I went back and read the book and was like, I really think that the screenwriter took a gem of what was in the book and changed it into a much better story. At least I liked it a lot better. And that was one of the rare times that I actually, it's the only time I can think of. I mean, usually I think of the book as just sort of a supplement. It just gives you a little more background. I like it when the books are very consistent with the movies. But sometimes they don't have to be, like The Notebook. Yes?
Going on the new adult thing, that's pretty big right now in the mass market.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself ever writing one?
I actually did start to write one, and I think I wrote 50 or 60 pages, and I was just a little after the boom. I actually got three or 4 offers from major publishers, and all of the offers were digital only. They only were going to put it out in digital. So I decided that I would not accept their offer, and that I probably would do just as well self-publishing it. I think the path to print publication for new adult right now is to self-publish it first and have it do well, and then a publisher picks up the rights. So someday maybe I'll finish writing that book. I forgot to mention I was working on that too. I'm about 60 pages into it. But I just didn't see any reason to, especially because I would have had to hurry up and write it really fast, and this way I can sort of take my time and not feel so pressured and be a little more in control of it if it was going to be digital only anyway. Do you have a question back there? I saw a hand go up. Another of my wonderful students.
Do you have any fears about the fact if one of your books was picked up and made to a series? Because, for example, there was the Percy Jackson series, and then that was butchered into the movies that they are now. So do you have any fears of like how, if like the amount of creative control you would have in that situation?
Right. I mean, I would hope to have some creative control, which actually reminds me of another book to movie that I actually liked the movie better, was Warm Bodies. That was another instance where they really changed it and I liked the movie better. You know, I would, if that ever were to happen, I would definitely want and hope that I could be involved. That would be my preference, because I've seen times where it was just done so badly. Like, I don't know if anybody read it's an old book called Blood and Chocolate, and it was a wonderful vampire or werewolf story. And then a movie version came out that was so not, I mean, they made their ages different and it was nothing like it. And I thought I would be so disappointed if I was that author with this beautiful book and then the movie was just completely different. But on the other hand, I always keep in the back of my mind that, you know, obviously some deal could be worked out where I could be involved. But for the most part, like, my book is mine when I'm writing it, and that's the only time it's mine. And then once I set it out into the world, it stops becoming mine and it becomes, you know, what everybody interprets it. That it doesn't matter if whatever I intended the story to be, if everybody interprets it differently, they're not wrong. That's, you know, it's their book then. So I am always very conscious of it, that it's not my book anymore once it goes out into the world. So I hope that I would not be as upset otherwise, because I don't feel that it's mine, and they're gonna, you know, ruin it. So I would like to be a little more, you know, if that wonderful thing ever happened where they made it into a movie, that I would just have faith that they would do a good job. I think for the most part that these producers have now learned from mistakes like that they really need to stay close to the book, and they've done such a good job with doing that with The Hunger Games and with Fault in Our Stars, and those are the movies from books that have become huge successes. And obviously Twilight did the same thing too, and obviously those movies were successful. So I'm hoping that Hollywood has learned its lesson from those missteps, that if you mess with a book that had a lot of followers, that people aren't going to be happy. So if that wonderful thing ever happened and they made a movie out of Magnolia, which I would like to point out that Ryder is 6'4" and Ansel Elgort is 6'4". That's all I'm saying. I didn't know that when I wrote it, but now I figured that out. But hopefully that they would do a good job, and I would just not have to be too worried about it. Yes?
How long do you estimate it takes you to write a book? And do you find, how does having to write a series, a group of books, to a publication date affect your writing habits?
Oh, it makes it so much harder. It's so the most wonderful time. I always tell writers who are, you know, pursuing publication that enjoy this time, because this is the best time ever. When you're writing your book and you don't have a deadline, and it's just amazing to have that kind of freedom with your creativity, that it's amazing how, even as much as I absolutely love writing and I'm so happy and ecstatic that it's my job, once it's your job and you have a deadline, you know, it's amazing how some of the fun gets sucked out of that. And it does often take me a long time to write a book, but a lot of that time is when it's still percolating in my head, and then, you know, suddenly my deadline is 4 weeks away, and then I can write a book very quickly in 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It probably took me about 6 weeks to write that, but that was after I had already written the first, say, 50 pages, so I already had, that's usually what happens. I write the first 3 chapters because that's what I have to give my publisher. And then when I finally get the okay from them, they say, yes, we like this, we want to publish it, then it takes me a really long time to get going again. You know, it can take me 3 months to really get going on it again. And so then all in all, it may take me, you know, 6 months to write the book, but I really wrote it in the last 6 weeks, you know. Really in the last week before it was due, I was staying up all night, every night, trying to finish it. The first book took me 9 months, interestingly enough. And that was the one that I had, no contract, and I was just writing it for fun. I think it took so long because I was learning so much along the way. I was going to my first conferences and learning about this structure kind of stuff that I teach in my classes. And I had written a first draft, and then once I started learning more about writing, realized I had no character goals, no motivation, no conflict. I was just sort of, writing. So I had to go back and revise, and I really did a really huge revision after going to my first RWA conference. And it was after that big, huge overhaul that I then submitted it and got an agent. So I was glad that I had learned that. But that one took the longest. I've never taken that long to write a book before. And that was basically because I was learning and then revising many more times. I'm not much of a reviser now. Now I start a book, and as I write a chapter, when I get ready to write the next one, I go back and revise what I've already written, so that by the time I get to the last chapter and write the end, that's it. I almost never, other than revisions with my editor, I actually don't, it's pretty much done. So I can write much faster now, but under great duress and unhappiness and stress.
Folks, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes?
How do you feel about fan fiction?
How do I feel about fan fiction? I love fan fiction. I can't tell you how ecstatic I was the first time I went on one of those fan fiction sites and found some Winter Haven fan fiction. I haven't found any Magnolia fan fiction yet, but I did find some Winter Haven, and it was wonderful. And like I said, I started off writing Gone with the Wind fan fiction when I was 12, and I think it's a great way to learn as a writer because so much of the work is already done for you. The world is developed, the characters are developed. Then you're just using your storytelling and really honing your craft of writing. So it's a great way to learn. I think it's great. I think it's flattering. I mean, up until the point that they then tried to sell it, then it would be a problem. But, as long as it's for fun and for sharing on the internet, I'm all for it. Great exercise for writers, I think. And then at some point you do have to break out and create your own world and your own characters. I don't think there's, any reason not to eventually spread your wings and fly if you enjoy writing that much. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. I have good news and bad news. For those of you who are in the store, there's cake. For those of you who are watching on the internet, there's no cake. But you can watch them eat the cake. Yes. Or you can call and order a book from us here at the store. We'll get it signed for you. Thank you so much for being here. The books are for sale behind the counter. Get your book. She'll sign them right here. Thank you all so much for coming.